Welcome everybody to the October version of Fire on the Fives. Fire on the Fives is put on by the National Weather Service Fire Weather Program to discuss fire weather and fire behavior, fire environment issues, and also items of interest for all of Weather Service personnel. Today, we are going to be talking about critical incident stress management. But first, I'd like to talk about a little bit about logistics, and then we'll launch into it. Logistics today, please ensure that you mute your phone or have used the audio pin provided. Please do not put your phone on hold. If you put your phone on hold, we will get the NOAA weather radio talking over the webinar. So again, please ensure that your phone is on mute or that a pin is provided or use the pin that's provided. The talks today will be recorded and posted to the National Weather Service Fire Weather YouTube at the URL below. We will ensure that link gets out to everybody so that if you don't get a copy down right now, don't sweat it. We'll get that out to everybody after the webinar. Today, we're going to be talking with Scott Russell and James Whittington. Scott is from the U.S. Forest Service and works at the South Carolina Coordination Center. Mr. Whittington is from Bureau of Land Management at the Medford, Oregon district. They are critical incident stress management professionals, have been trained in critical incident stress management, or CISM, as you may hear it called today. And they're going to be talking about how to recognize and deal with stress during and after critical incidents. Obviously, it's been a major year for the National Weather Service. Several hurricanes have rolled over continental United States and Puerto Rico, causing tremendous damage in those areas, and still dealing with the recovery efforts there. And then, of course, a big wildfire season as well, with things still unfolding in California. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Scott Russell, and he will tell us a little bit more about critical incident stress management.
All right, thanks, Larry. Just a second, and we'll pull up my screen for everybody to see. Hopefully everybody can see that current screen at this time. 2017, reactions to a historic year. Again, as Larry mentioned, my name's Scott Russell. I'm with the U.S. Forest Service. I do have an alphabet behind my name through years of study, college, university, including some advanced critical incident stress management courses. Part of my background includes 15 years in the fire service, 5 of it operational, and then 10 of it working in the dispatch center. Prior to that, I was a chaplain doing disaster medicine for the National Disaster Medical Services and providing CISM support in disaster settings. If you dig far enough back into my background, you also find out I'm an Army veteran who served in the Army Military Police. So that's a little bit about my background. I've got 30 plus years of dealing with CISM, mostly doing it and some teaching of it. But I want to go back to 2017. 2017, I lost the number of times somebody said in a report that it was historic or record-breaking of a year. When we look at critical incident stress management, we frequently use a cliche or statement that it's about having normal reactions to an abnormal event. 2017, an abnormal event. It was an unprecedented year for all of us who deal with the weather or with wildfire. So much so that on August 31st, the chair of the National Multi-Agency Coordinating Group sent out a letter to everybody. And the first sentence of his letter says, the current national emergency management situation is one that none of us have ever experienced. So when we start talking about CISM, we start talking about having typical reactions to an atypical event. One of the things to remember here is that 2017 was not an atypical event. 2017 was a series of atypical events that ultimately led to an unprecedented situation. With that unprecedented situation, the question becomes, how do we handle it? Well, We handle it as best we can during the time, but what are some of the potential concerns or the cumulative effect that this year is going to have on us as individuals and as an organization? For example, I was in a conversation last month and a colleague of mine mentioned the national preparedness levels. Most of you realize that the national preparedness levels operate on a scale of 1 to 5. Well, back in late July, early August, we had reached preparedness level 5 nationally due to the wildfire situation. It was while we were at the highest preparedness level 5, that started to get hurricanes in the Atlantic. So what do we do when we're already at the highest preparedness level, where resources are already pulled to the maximum, when we're already dealing with a shortage of all our resources, and then we have a whole different type of disaster occur? My colleague jokingly said we need to go to a 10-level preparedness level, 5 of it only associated with wildfires, and then the other 5 associated with other types of disasters that we're called upon to respond to. While he was joking at the time, there's some merit to that. The preparedness level 5 that we experienced in 2017 was unlike any other preparedness level 5 we've dealt with. Several of us have been called upon to go from the wildfires out west to the hurricanes that were affecting the southeast United States and the eastern seaboard. When we look at these two types of natural disasters, there's some commonalities there, but there's also some major differences between the two. Right off the bat, starting on the left-hand side, there's not enough water. In wildfire situations, we don't have enough water most of the time. In hurricane situations, obviously, we've got too much water. But we're dealing with two natural disasters, two catastrophic disasters with the potential to have life-threatening, life-taking impact on the population. So consequently, we were at PL5 in early to mid-August dealing with the wildfires when the Atlantic hurricane season decided to kick up. And this Atlantic hurricane season was once again an unprecedented Atlantic hurricane season that we were dealing with. So here we have not an atypical or an abnormal event, but a series of atypical abnormal events that led to a historic year, both from a perspective of wildfires and a perspective of hurricanes. As I sat down to pull together this presentation, and I wanted to focus more on the cumulative stress, the overall long-term effect that this season has had on all of us, I looked at the differences between wildfires and hurricanes. And to me, they're very symbolic or representative if you look at the model between acute or sudden incident stress and the cumulative long-term effect that we're dealing with. So as I look at some of these things and I start talking about the differences, I want to emphasize that the stress itself may be very similar, but the factors that lead up to the stress can be radically different. For example, if we look at wildfires, they tend to be sudden and intense, unexpected and traumatic events, much like you would see with your standard critical incident, a single traumatic, unexpected event. However, when you look at hurricanes, we typically have days worth of advance notice. We have days as we're watching the system develop and come across the Atlantic. And the question's only a matter of where is it going to go, not what is it going to do. So consequently, we have this long-term period of stress as we're anticipating, in planning, in preparing, in dealing with it 24 hours a day as we're watching a hurricane. Whereas with a wildfire, it tends to pop up quick, suddenly. Next thing you know, it's 3,000 acres and it's starting to go after people's houses or neighborhoods. You don't typically get 3, 5, 7 days to build up and prepare for it. Yes, the conditions may be there and you can predict the conditions, but ultimately it's not something that you're tracking days ahead of time. With a hurricane, you can see it coming. Another interesting note is with a wildfire, there is an attempt to manage wildfires. We believe we have some sort of control or ability to affect the direction, the duration, and the intensity of a wildfire. Nobody in the Southeast United States sat there and said, okay, how do we divert Harvey from coming ashore? How do we talk Harvey out of dumping 12 to 20 inches of rain in this location? In that situation, all you can do is simply hang on and prepare for the impact that's going to come. There's no way to try and manage or mitigate the ferocity of a hurricane. So while with wildfires, we believe that we have some ability to control or impact the intensity, the duration, and the severity. Ultimately, with a hurricane, we're simply there to observe and react after the fact. So big buildup with a hurricane, lots of time, lots of energy going into the development and the tracking of this. So it's more of a cumulative stress situation, whereas with a wildfire, except for the fact that you can bounce from one incident to the next incident, each specific wildfire is almost its own acute or sudden incident, if you will. So my focus is going to be primarily on the cumulative stress. And I did want to emphasize that even with wildfires, when you have a long duration wildfire season, when you do multiple deployments to multiple incidences, you know, you just get home from one, next thing you know, you're being asked to go to another one. That ultimately does lead to cumulative stress, much like a long-term, very active hurricane season does. When we look at stress, we talk about stress as the physical, cognitive, emotional, relational, behavioral, and spiritual response to reality not meeting our desires or our beliefs. So consequently, stress is a natural, inherent part of our life. We've had stress from early childhood. We'll have stress right up until the time we die. Consequently, most of us have developed methods or tools for managing or dealing with our stress. However, as a situation changes, as we spend more and more time dealing with abnormal situations, our standard coping mechanisms for dealing with stress can get overwhelmed. We start adding longer hours, perhaps a change in our diet, change in activity level, not being able to engage in some of those relaxing, stress-relieving tools that we're used to engaging in because the operational tempo has increased to such a point that we're not really getting 2 and 3 days off in a row. Or if we are, we're just coming back from one assignment with 2 days off and getting ready to roll into the next assignment. This leads to cumulative stress. Cumulative stress is the stress that gets accrued over time and is not being completely resolved, managed, or mitigated. It's often associated with fatigue. Now, I want to take a little time to talk about fatigue because fatigue is not merely tiredness. Fatigue is more of a long-term, long-duration exhaustion that you simply can't mitigate with the simple 12 hours of sleep. So as we talk about fatigue, I want to focus on the fact that repeated high stressor events, increased durations, high operational workload, inadequate rest and recuperation results in a reduction in physical, cognitive, and emotional functioning. So the more we engage in an atypical workload, a higher operational tempo, even if we're still getting the normal or our typical amount of sleep at night, that's not necessarily the rest that's needed to mitigate fatigue. And if you can't mitigate the fatigue, it just adds to the cumulative stress, making the stress level even more difficult. So consequently, we get a reduction in our resiliency, our ability to rapidly and effectively rebound from events that affect us. So not only are we having back-to-back events, a higher operational tempo, we're starting to get fatigued as the season wears on, and then we're losing our ability to manage our stress completely from one event to the next. At a certain point in time, the cumulative stress itself becomes a critical incident for us. We lose our ability to disengage sufficiently to recover to prepare for the next event. So those are some of the byproducts of the higher operational tempo for a series of not one but repeated non-typical events that wear on us. So let's look at some of the impacts of what this cumulative stress can do to us. Again, like acute stress, unmanaged stress, stress that has not been completely resolved, cumulative stress can result in physical, emotional, spiritual, I forgot the word cognitive, but intellectual and interpersonal problems. It affects us physically. It can cause hypertension, higher blood pressure. It can cause us to lose sleep at night. It can affect us emotionally, spiritually, cognitively, and again, with our relationships. And I know talking earlier, James is going to go a little more into the importance of the communication and the teamwork. I just want to briefly mention it here with you guys, because again, as our stress levels go up, or as we are struggling with unmanaged cumulative stress, it will adversely, or has the potential to adversely affect our teamwork and our communication, which consequently, by adversely affecting our teamwork and communication, leads to an increase in stress. So, another concern of cumulative stress is burnout, job fatigue, or loss of interest and desire to continue to work in that environment. Not uncommon after a series of atypical traumatic events, people start going, really, do I want to do this again next year? Do I want to face this again next year? It can lead to people choosing another career path. Like with any sort of a stress reaction, general philosophy is take some time, think it over, don't make any rash decisions. What's not on this slide, but something that we talked about recently as well, was there is a reverse to this burnout. And that reverse is known as, trauma addiction, hypervigilance, getting addicted, crisis addiction, if you will, where because of the series of ongoing events, when things do quiet, when things do normalize, we're unable to slow down our personal operational tempo. We're looking for the next incident. We're looking for the next crisis. We're basically on an adrenaline rush, a trauma adrenaline rush. So I want to emphasize that is definitely one of the potential side effects of cumulative stress. On one hand, you have the burnout where you start going, wait a second, what am I doing? I don't want to go to work. I may not want to continue this career path. On the other hand, you can have when the operational tempo slows down, the inability to yourself step back, take a break, and slow down. Now, the bottom point to this is it can lead to serious health issues. And by serious health issues, I've already mentioned hypertension, high blood pressure, the sedentary nature of our jobs. I work in a dispatch center. I'm surrounded by 6 computer monitors all day long. I very seldom, between 8 to 12 hours, step away from my console for very long. And I'm receiving all my information, all my world contact through a telephone, a radio, or one of these 6 screens in front of me. I'm leading a very sedentary lifestyle. If I don't remind myself to get up and stretch my legs once in a while, start spending 8, 10, 12 hours a day sitting behind a desk, staring at monitors, even though I'm very mentally and cognitively busy, I'm also very physically sedentary. And if I don't get up and stretch and move around a little bit, then it's going to adversely affect me physically. So in our line of work specifically, where we do a lot of stuff by monitoring computers and radios and being in a central office location, that has the potential to create serious health issues with us. One of my dispatchers is famous for a note that says, "This is dispatch, there are no escape routes, there are no safety zones." And the whole mindset there is that we're engaged operationally from the start of our day till the end of our day. There's not really, unless we consciously stop and take a moment, we don't plan escape routes, or we don't plan moments where we're going to say enough and we're going to disengage. We do not have that in our system. No matter how bad things get, if anything, we're tuned more into those computer monitors. So all of this can lead to very serious health issues. So what do we do about it? Well, first one is recognize the impact it's having on us. Take a look at how you are physically, emotionally, spiritually, cognitively at this point in time, and compare that to back in February, before the start of this historic wildfire, historic hurricane season. Where are you at? Number two, seek assistance. There's several programs out there. We have the Employee Assistance Program. You can always turn to peers. You know, sometimes just having somebody who understands what you've gone through to sit down and listen to you talk about and share your story is beneficial. Clergy is an excellent option, and MHP stands for Mental Health Professionals. I am a huge proponent of mental health professionals. I throw a little caveat in there with all of these categories. Make sure you're dealing with people that understand cumulative and acute stress management. You know, there's different fields in the mental health field, and some of them may or may not be more suitable to you. Number three, disengage when and where you can. If you find that even though we're having a nice couple of weather days and we're not having to issue alerts and warnings, that you're still looking at the sky wondering when the next storm's going to happen, then perhaps you need to talk to somebody about the need to disengage. When the operational tempo slows down, if you yourself cannot slow down, then you might want to talk to somebody about how better to disengage when it's time to disengage. And number four, see the bigger picture. It has been a very challenging year on the weather front. It has been a very challenging year on the fire front. It has been a very challenging year in dealing with hurricanes. And a lot of people's lives have been deeply and adversely affected. On the flip side of that, I've seen lots of acts of kindness and great things that people have done in the face of adversity. See the bigger picture. Look at it in the context of your life. Look at it in the context of how many years have you been doing this? Yeah, this year may have been a rough one, but some years have been easier, and some years have also been tough, but we got through the other ones as well. Finally, use some common stress management tools. We talked a little earlier about peer support, talking to people, constructive conversations. I put the word constructive in there because not every conversation is going to be a constructive conversation, and you would prefer as a positive stress management tool to engage in a constructive conversation. Even if you're unhappy, dissatisfied with something, there is a way to engage in that conversation with other people in a constructive manner. If all you want to do is complain and yell and scream, yeah, that's okay, as long as you tell them, hey, all I want to do is vent. And you're not asking for anybody to fix the situation, you're just asking for somebody to be there. Laughter is an excellent thing. Trying to find the humor. Back when I was with the Disaster Medical Services, we went to the Pentagon on 9/11. That was our deployment, our big deployment for our team that year. And there was, quite frankly, a lot of morbid humor associated with that assignment. What I remember several years later now is the things that we laughed about. And so laughter is an excellent tool. Prayer and meditation, again, a couple of excellent tools to help you out, to help you stay focused. Hugging, human contact, intimacy, obviously, you know, using your current support network, your significant others There's absolutely nothing wrong with reaching out to somebody and saying, sometimes I just need a hug. So there's other things you can do: music, hobbies, television, video games, escapism, reading. One of the things we like to do here in the Southeast United States is comfort foods. We have a whole bunch of them. But yeah, that can be an excellent source of comfort for you, again, in moderation. Socialization, talking to other people that you can relate to, or talking to somebody who's completely removed from your environment, who doesn't have a clue what you've gone through. And so consequently, they're not in a position to make judgments or recommendations. Sometimes you just need somebody to talk to you. Critical incident stress management tools, pre-incident education. That's one of the things that we really advocate is, understand how things potentially can affect you going into a situation so that you are better prepared and more resilient when stressful events happen. And then finally, after action reviews, which is conversations that you have going, hey, what went well? What could we do better? Non-judgmental, but honest and fair evaluation of how you and your program handled the situation. These are common stress management tools. They will apply both in critical incident stress management as well as in the cumulative stress side of the house. All right, well, that pretty much covers my section for everybody. There is my contact information, and if anybody has any questions for me at this moment, I can answer them now, but I thought, Larry, you were going to do just a general question and answer at the end. Is that correct?
I believe so. And with the way the webinar is set up, what will happen is folks can type in their question, and Robin will get those questions, and then she can ask them to you guys. Robin, do you have any questions right now that have been asked of Scott? I'll take that. Okay. All right. So with that, thank you very much, Scott. Much appreciated. And yes, please hang on, and I'm sure that questions may come up after the end of Jim's presentation. And I would highly encourage those on the line to take advantage of this. And if you have questions about CISM, please write those questions to Robin through the chat feature on GoToWebinar, and we'll get those questions asked for you. With that, Scott, if you could right-click on Jim's name and make him the presenter.
Okay, I have done that. So.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. My name is Jim Whittington. I am a information officer and a liaison officer with one of the Type 1 teams here in the Northwest. I'm also an agency representative for BLM. I teach a lot of classes, including You Will Not Stand Alone, and I'm also a coach and evaluator for S520, which is the class Command and General Staff need to be on a Type 1 team. So those are my credentials, and I thought I'd start off by talking a little bit about how the wildland fire agencies got to where we're at right now, and why we put so much emphasis on critical incident stress and looking at other kinds of stresses that impact our folks. I think maybe the critical piece was the Esperanza fire a few years ago, where we lost 5 firefighters. There was a recognition at that point that we were just reinventing the wheel every time we had a fatality or a serious accident, with memorial services, with family interactions, dealing with coworkers, all that kind of stuff. And so what we decided to do was come up with a class, and it eventually became the You Will Not Stand Alone class, to try to deal with some of these things. As we were developing that class and testing it out, we realized that it wasn't going to be just about fatalities and serious accidents. There were many other things that were going on, and we also realized that our actions weren't meeting the words. Our agencies were, our leadership, our folks were saying the right things, but the actions weren't really lining up with what we needed, and we had too many people standing alone for suicides, automobile accidents, the regular work stresses. We've never really come to a good understanding of the tension between being a land management agency 12 months of the year and being an emergency response agency 6 to 9 months out of the year. And so those kinds of stresses and those kinds of things kind of all fed into this. And so we've tried to change the culture. We've tried to change the way we educate and teach people. And I think that the lessons we've learned are very applicable to the National Weather Service. And speaking of you guys, I think you belong in the same group as us in terms of public safety for a number of reasons. One is, I think, as Scott was talking about, you have some very similar stresses. The other thing is that when you look at what you guys do, you may have your coworkers standing beside you, you may have your neighboring offices standing beside you, but there's nobody behind you. There's no one you guys can call for 911. If you don't do the job you're supposed to do and you don't do it well, then civilization suffers. Maybe only temporarily, but it can definitely have an effect. And same with us. And so there's a stress that comes with that, with being that last backstop for folks. And then there's also the stress that comes with the realization that no matter how well you do your job, a lot of times Mother Nature has different ideas, and you end up with a situation that is not desirable and that you can't affect the change. As Scott mentioned, I think one of the other issues is that we on fires can go out and take action, and it's very difficult for you guys in the Weather Service to actually go out and do something. It's almost like you're watching things unfold behind a black curtain, and that creates some stress as well, because you can't relieve that stress by actually going and doing something. And one of the fascinating things about working on Type 1 incident management teams is you get to see how communities react to fires and incidents. And one of the things that is pretty common is that local law enforcement, who are used to very short-term, discrete incidents, get overwhelmed and get incredibly stressed out when they have a fire that goes on for several days or a few weeks, and the town's evacuated and their family's affected and their friends are affected, and they don't know how to manage that because they don't have the experience, they don't have the slides in their head about what to do. So we spend a lot of time with local law enforcement on incidents, working through some of those stresses that they're feeling and trying to keep them engaged in the incident and making sure they're taking care of the family and all that. And I think that some of you folks, particularly in the hurricane areas, probably experience some of that, where you're used to seeing something on a screen, but now it's right there in front of you, and your family and your friends and your neighborhood, your community, they're all affected. So I think that's a huge stressor. And then as we look at the world, there's an increasing complexity out there. As Scott said, we're seeing things we've never seen before. I can't tell you how many times in the last 10 years I've been on a fire where I've heard somebody say, we don't get fires like that here. Well, now we do. And now we get hurricanes, and now we get these things in places where people have moved. There's a lot more folks out there, and that creates a much higher potential for the human element to be affected by the things that we're responsible for, the things that we're monitoring, the things we're trying to communicate. So that increased complexity, I think, is also a stressor because it's new. There's new things going on, and we can't rely on our traditional ways of thinking when we're dealing with this stuff. So that brings me to kind of the basics of what we tell folks when we're teaching them how to be type 1 incident management team folks. You want to communicate under stress, you want to make decisions under stress, and you want to manage your stress. And if you can do those three things on your worst day, you're going to be doing okay. So I want to talk about all three of those. And I should mention that, this is not in a vacuum. That one of the requirements you have to have, one of the things you have to do is to help others, watch out for others, and allow others to watch out for you. And to be honest with yourself and allow others to have honest conversations with you, because they may be seeing some things that are affecting you that you're not quite seeing. And sometimes just the knowledge, having somebody point something out or describe something makes all the difference in the world. You can say, oh, wow, I am doing that. I need to pay attention to that. And I need to see if I can mitigate that in some way. So I think one of the interesting things about the Weather Service is you guys are primarily into risk communication. And I think you do a really good job of it. But there's a huge stress there that comes because when you talk about risk, a lot of times people don't hear the risk part of it. They just will take the most salacious or the most dramatic point in your communications and build that up. And so a hurricane that has a chance of hitting a place is all of a sudden going to wipe that place out once it gets into the public consciousness. And so there's a real stress about being misunderstood, about being misinterpreted. And that's a really tough thing to deal with a lot of times. On the crisis communication side, when something's actually happening and the worst case scenario has come to pass, the problem there is, are you heard above the din of the activity that's going on? Or can you communicate to the folks that need the information that you're providing? That's a huge stressor. And then the interpersonal stuff. I think one of the big differences between the National Weather Service and I should say that, I've spent a lot of time with the Medford Forecast Office here, and I've watched them in high tempo times and how they communicate, and they do a great job. I think they push out anywhere from 800, 900, 1,000 spot forecasts that we depend on every year, and it's really interesting watching them on those high tempo days. One of the things that struck me about watching them is that they have to do this, and they do this as a team, and they do this together. And I'm assuming the rest of the Weather Service does this as well, with people that they work with all year round. When we go out on a fire with an incident management team, it's not people we normally work with every day. So we can depend on, say, Joe to do a really great job because he's dialed in and he's ready to go for the 2 to 3 weeks that we're dealing with the fire. And we don't have that baggage of knowing that Joe leaves Cheetos on the computer desk or spills Coke on the conference table or any of those kinds of annoying things that people do year round. And so you almost have to have a shift whenever you're into a tough situation. And, one of the things we always talk about in fire is that you have to assume that people are there for the best of intentions, with the best of intentions. And if you have some personal issues, if you have some conflicts, put it on the back burner. It's not that important. The mission is the most critical thing, and you can deal with that. So just keep that in mind. And again, there's a concept we have in fire that we've kind of borrowed from special forces in the military, that kind of borrowed it from classical rhetoric. It's called parrhesia, and it's an idea that you have honest communication with one another, and that the speaker comes from that with an appreciation for the listener, and that you want them to meet their potential, and the listener has to have the idea that they are receiving that information with the best of intentions. So just some thoughts there about the difficulties you guys might face in that interpersonal communication. And then, the other thing about communications is when you're talking to the public, it's much different than talking to each other. And you have to adjust your expectations, and you may have to define things a little bit more. And that can even be more stressful when you're doing that. when we're looking at making decisions under stress, more and more we're seeing what the social scientist folks call complex adaptive problems. It's not just complex, but it's constantly changing. Hurricanes, fires, all those things are complex adaptive problems. And our ability to function in those environments is directly related to the amount of education and training, and particularly where failure is safe and allowed, because we have to know what failure means. You get stressed out, you want to know what it feels like leading up to that stressful moment, because then if you can figure out what is going on as you're leading up to it, maybe you can change your experience, you can change your what you're doing, and try to get over that hump and not be as stressed out as you would be if you continue down the same path. I think that's a great quote by Coach Wooden. Be quick, but don't hurry. Be quick means that you know your job and you know how to do it, and you're doing it well. You're not hurrying. You're not letting events overwhelm you. You're not getting behind the curve in terms of not seeing all the things you're supposed to see. This is a little schema of critical events, incidents, put together by Preston Klein, the University of Pennsylvania, and it kind of reads from the top blue down, alternating blue, red, blue, red. And I want to call your attention to these three on the blue side: moment of recognition, moment of reaction, moment of response. Moment of recognition is kind of the oh crap moment, where you realize that, oh, wow, we have a hurricane that is going to hit Miami, or we have a fire that's going to hit town. Whatever it is, that's that moment of recognition where all the variables, all the information kind of aligns and gives you a picture. At that very second, your first reaction is for your brain to shift into the backside of the brain, the more primitive part of the brain. There's a tiger out there. What do? I'm going to freeze. I'm going to fight. I'm going to flee. And we have to overcome that right away. And a lot of times this happens within a few seconds. But that process of recognizing, reacting, and then trying to move that reaction from the primitive part of the brain up to the frontal cortex and the more rational part of the brain can be incredibly stressful, even if we don't realize it at the time. And so what you want to do is you want to get to that moment of response where you have an educated, thoughtful response. And again, this could take place in just a very short amount of time, but it creates a tremendous amount of stress on your body, on your mental capacities. And again, it's easier to get to the moment of response and an educated response. The more training, the more experience you have, the more slides you have in your head about what this might look like. And the other thing I want to mention is closure. It's very important to have formal closure with a group, with a meeting, any kind of thing, where you say, okay, this event, this season, whatever it is, we're closing it out. This is behind us. That does a couple things. That allows people to put it behind them, and it allows others to identify the folks who can't quite put it behind them, and it allows the folks who can't quite put it behind them to self-recognize that they're in that situation. And so that's when you look for some of those levels of assistance that Scott talked about, if you can't get past that closure part. There's varying degrees of that, and there's varying degrees of assistance. But I think the important thing to remember is to have that formal closure process, again, just to give the permission to folks. Managing your stress, Scott talked about a few of those. Compassion fatigue is one I think that's really important. And, we all experience this to some degree. And again, if you're not actively involved, it's probably more prevalent. When I did, I've done 7 fatality incidents for a total of 31 deaths. And you definitely feel it. You're not, the fatalities happened, away from you or before you got to the incident, but you're definitely distressed by what's going on. And I think that you can see that. I think that plays out sometimes in the work that IMETs do, and obviously the work that the forecast offices do when they have weather events that create some human misery. I've definitely felt that in my career. Burnout, a little more definition there. That slow erosion thing, I think, is the key. It's very hard to recognize, and it's very hard to self-diagnose too. So that's when you need that honest conversation with your peers and folks who support you. Let me see here. I will say that in looking at both of those, the two big fatality incidents I've been on, one was Iron 44, where a helicopter crashed and 9 folks died. And after I worked that, I did not go through CISM, and I had a pretty tough time of it. Getting back to normal work was not easy, and I was pretty much useless for 4 or 5 months. People would ask me to do something, and I'd be like, that doesn't seem really important because I just went through this thing where all these guys died, and you're asking me to do this stupid regular work stuff. It took me a little while to get over that. And then when I went to Yarnell, I did go through the CISM process, and it wasn't any great epiphany. It was just talking with another firefighter, and just the idea that what you're going through is a normal experience to abnormal kinds of things, that you just mention it, and all of a sudden, oh, okay, that's why I'm feeling that way. So it's not any touchy-feely stuff. It's just a kind of a framing of your thoughts in a way that allows you to make sense of it. So I wouldn't hesitate to do CISM or recommend CISM for any reason. All right, so I think one of the key things in terms of what we've done in Wildland Fire is we've tried to become a learning organization, and that doesn't mean, or that's not confined to learning about the science, the technology, all that good stuff. It also includes the human interactions, the social issues, the stresses that we experience. And we also figured out that if we're going to really make organizational change, if we're going to change the way we teach people, the way we utilize folks, that it has to come from the bottom up. I mean, it's classic organizational theory that the higher up you get in an organization, the more you forget the stresses, the trade-offs, the challenges of the everyday work. And I think that's one of the things we're really trying to do in terms of the way we educate firefighters now. It used to be that we would train folks, and we would do that by just assigning them to somebody who knew a lot of stuff or had a lot of experience, but didn't have any real knowledge about how to teach adults. And so you would end up getting feedback, and I had this in my career, hey, you suck, you need to kind of suck less if you can. And that was pretty much it. And so you kept doing these repetitive things until you got to the point where your suckitude was a little bit less and acceptable, and then you went on and did your job. But you always had this stressful idea that, am I really living up to this ideal, or am I letting folks down? So we've tried to change the whole way we educate folks to take that kind of stress off and to teach them in a way that adults learn. And I think that definitely came from the bottom up. That was not a management decision, a management choice. We kind of forced that on folks. So I hope that you guys will take some of that to heart and look to see how you can better your organization and make it work from there. So with that, I'll take any questions, comments, concerns, and my contact information is right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Jim. I really appreciate it. That was outstanding, and appreciate you guys joining us today for this. To maybe kick off this discussion and a little bit of question and answer here, I had heard previously that sometimes with this cumulative stress that the trigger for you may think that you got things under control, or you think you've got it figured out, and then all of a sudden there's a triggering event, and it can be weeks, months, even years after the stressful things that you've gone through, and it may seem minor. So let me give you an example where maybe where we'd see it on the weather end is you've gone through all the hurricanes and you've gone through the stress of all these forecasts and seeing the destruction around you, and then 2 years later you have a minor flooding event that one person is killed because they drove through the flood and the car washed away, and all of a sudden all these feelings come flooding back, and you hadn't dealt with really what was going on with the events of 2017, but here you are in 2019, and all of a sudden you're having this abnormal reaction, and maybe that's not the right way to say it, but you're having an abnormal reaction to something that doesn't seem to fit the way you're reacting to it. Could you address that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll
take a.
Go ahead, Scott.
Okay. Basically, what you're describing is what's known as sensory triggers, and sensory triggers can be any of a number of things, and for some reason, there's a trigger there that brings up all these emotions and all these feelings and stuff like that. Now, ironically enough, the sense of smell can be one of the most powerful of those sensory triggers, or it could very well be a sound. It could be a feeling. If you were outside your weather service office and we're facing these nice 40, 50 mile an hour breezes while the hurricane was offshore but getting ready to come onshore, and then suddenly 2 years later, you step outside the office and a wind gust just hits you, and it just immediately takes you back to that experience you had. Again, these are sensory triggers. They're not uncommon. The question becomes, how frequently are they occurring, and how is it affecting you? Does it make you suddenly run back inside? Does the sound of a car backfiring cause you to try and dive for cover someplace? Or does it just make you jump and you gotta go, wait a second, it's okay, different time, different place sort of idea. So it's not uncommon for sensory triggers to continue to bring things back up. The question is, how frequently are they being brought back up? And are they being brought up in such an intrusive manner that they're affecting you? Not just a sudden, oh my gosh, but rather it's really causing a major reaction to you. So depending upon the severity of it, and again, it could happen 2 years, it could happen 5 years later. It can be any of a number of things. And one of the things that I've discovered is sometimes I don't know what caused it. I just know that all of a sudden this is affecting me and I'm back at this place and I'm going, wait a second. No, this isn't that traumatic event from 5 years ago. And I got to kind of grab a hold of myself and go, let's stop for a second. So, Jim, go ahead.
So a couple points. I think one of the things that led us to work on the You Will Not Stand Alone class and change it a little bit is that we had an experience where a BLM employee, a tree fell on her vehicle as she was driving through the woods and killed her. And so we had CISM for the unit there, and folks didn't really want to talk about that accident. They wanted to talk about one of their coworkers who had committed suicide a couple years ago before the accident. And we came to realize that the agency, the organization, had not done anything to address that. It was, Bob's gone, let's get back to work. And those feelings and that kind of sense of betrayal came up in relation to the accident that we had. And so I think you need to kind of look at this holistically too. And, personally, I'll also say that when I was on Yarnell, I felt kind of guilty because I kept thinking about stuff that I'd gone through during Iron 44. And when I went through the CISM process myself, I figured out that it's normal for you to, for your brain to trigger back to the first traumatic experience you have of that kind and try to make sense of the current situation through that filter. And so you might see some of that too. as you go forward after this year. You might keep coming back to the experiences you had this year, even though you're experiencing something different in the future.
Thank you. Robin, any questions being brought up by the group?
Yes. So first off, I just wanted to announce that we are recording this webinar. So this webinar and the associated slides will be available for you at a later point in time. They'll be posted on the IMIC Google Sites page under Fire in the Fives, but I will send out that link through the region so you guys have access to that. I do have a question here for Scott. And the question is, what advice do you have for managers, especially those who have not deployed, to help an employee when he or she returns to the home office?
Listen, that's where you start out with. You have no idea what the employee that deployed went through or where their status is at. So consequently, simply being willing to listen. How are you doing? And listen. If the employee says, I'm fine. Some of the things were pretty bad, but I'm okay. Then watch. Is the employee, in fact, doing everything back to their normal routine? So even though it may be a bad event or there may be a series of bad events that occur, it doesn't necessarily mean that the employee is going to show signs and symptoms of not having managed that. So regardless, a situation where one employee comes back and says, you know what, it was horrible, but I'm fine. Another employee may have been on the same assignment, come back and say, yeah, I'm fine, but then start showing signs and symptoms that says, yeah, maybe there's a little more going on than this. But the first thing is ask and listen and then watch. And then if you are seeing things, your employee may truly be thinking that they are fine. The signs and symptoms, and there's a set of them, of acute reaction, typical reactions. I've got that posted on my refrigerator at home because when and if I'm struggling with a stressful situation, I'm not managing my stress well, I'm the last person to know, and I'm the person who teaches this. It takes, in my case, a family member, or it could be a peer that says, hey, you say you're fine, but are you aware that, you're doing this or that or whatever else? It usually takes somebody else to let me know that I'm struggling because I don't see it myself. So as a supervisor, ask the question, listen to the answer, and then observe to see if it's being validated. So that would be my advice right off the bat.
Let me add one thing to that, Scott, and that is that if you're a supervisor, you need to put in the work before they go on the assignment so that when they come back and you have that conversation, you have credibility engaging in that conversation. You want a good relationship before they go on a stressful assignment, and you have to convey that you are definitely concerned about them and that they're important, and you have to do that and establish that beforehand.
Excellent point. I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both. The next question I have is from one of our folks on the line is, how do you become nationally certified in CISM?
The land management agencies, back when they started this program, contacted an organization known as the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, ICISF.org. And they're an international organization that kind of was founded by the two PhD, MD types that created debriefings and diffusings and kind of put all this together in the late 1980s. There's a series of courses that you can take through those things. Now, they will help you gain the knowledge. There's even courses on how you can form your own CISM team. Ultimately, it's up to each agency to the extent that they're going to support or recommend and stuff like that. The Department of Interior has done a really great job, and the U.S. Forest Service has basically been mirroring the Department of Interior over the last few years on this thing. But certainly, there's some base level courses there that I encourage people to take. There is one national certification, and it's from the University of Maryland, I do believe it is, but they actually have a full test that you have to go through. But they recommend you take all these courses in advance. All these courses involve practices and scenarios and stuff like that. So, you know, there's at least 3 or 4 different courses I would think that you'd want to take just to get the foundational knowledge and understanding of critical incident stress management. And the land management agencies, GEMS, mine, all the land management agencies on the federal level use the curriculum and the instructors from the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, ICISF.org.
Thank you. The next question is how...
Scott, real quick. So the fire agencies also put on CISM courses. Is that correct?
Yeah. Now, what it is they actually they bring in the instructors, ICISF instructors, to teach in different locations, and it's the fire training website. I don't think I have it right off the top of my head. Jim, do you have that information readily accessible?
Let's see. It's through NWCG, I believe. That class is. I can send that, or one of us can send that information to Larry and Michelle for distribution. But what that class does primarily, I think, is sets you up to be a peer responder, so that you can go out and talk to folks who have the same kind of experiences that you've had and kind of help them work through it.
Excellent.
Correct. Yeah. This is Robin, and I've been through that course, and can now be a peer responder. And so I would love for some of our other weather service folks to go through that land management course as well, to be able to be peer responders for other folks that go either do storm surveys or fire deployments or whatever it is, to have those resources within our own agency.
Yeah, and that organization has created, I do believe they're up to about 70 or 80 different types of courses. There's everything from pastoral crisis information to grief after acute trauma, you know, how to deal with a sudden death sort of idea, to line of duty deaths, helping the best prepare for the worst. But again, they start out with the basic peer course, the small group course, and kind of an overview of CISM. And it's a great course, and I do encourage people to get involved with it. Now, the land management agencies, they contract the instructors from ICISF to come out to teach in a specific area, and then they advertise it through the wildland fire community. So there's an opportunity to do that. But that said, you know, the ICISF folks have got seminars on this all over the country. So if you don't have, for example, the ability to get to Reno, to the Great Basin area for one of their courses, Atlanta does a 4-day ICISF intensive every year in the springtime. And you can just literally go through their website and sign up and take 3, 4, 5 of their courses. It won't be geared specifically for the wildland fire community, but nonetheless, the training itself is identical. It's just the scenarios that they use will be slightly different.
And I should say that kind of a related class that is a family liaison class. The wildland fire folks do not currently have that. We're trying to get it put together and get it going. Some of the larger municipal fire departments like FDNY and LA County do have classes for family liaisons, and that would be if you had somebody, if you had a fatality or a serious accident and the agency needed someone to be with the family and help them through some of those processes that come after those situations. That's what that family liaison's for.
Yeah, another one of their excellent courses. And like I said, so yes, in the wildland fire community, we do draw instructors from ICISF to teach specific courses, but then ICISF, you know, have got multiple regional trainings and courses as well. I'm just looking at their calendar right now. They'll be in Atlanta in next April. They'll be in Missouri and Pennsylvania in March.
Great, thank you. Next question is, how common is survivor's guilt, and can this be mitigated somehow?
Jim, you want to go first on that one?
I think that one of the things about all these stresses we've been talking about is that some of the ways to deal with it are all very similar, and a lot of those were included in some of Scott's slides. I think you have to have, I think the closure part of it is key, and you have to have some support. You can't just, again, stand alone in this kind of stuff. There is some, I think circumstances probably play a lot into how you would deal with survivor's guilt. But again, I think the fixes are very similar. Scott, I'm kind of fumbling here.
Okay, no problem. One of the things I'll just point out to you is that all the research says that on average, 50 to 60% of disaster responders will suffer from post-traumatic stress. 50 to 60%. So half the people that wind up going out in the field. I don't have the numbers for those of us who watch it all on screens, but I can suggest that, that number is going to be equal to, if not higher than. The question is, how do we define it? Are we talking about someone who just feels a little guilty, feels like maybe I could have done more, or are we talking about somebody that engages in a pattern of self-destructive behavior because they feel like they may have failed in a critical situation? So, which level of survivor guilt are we talking about? I would say that everybody who's involved in our line of work does it because we care. And when we care and things don't go the way we want them to go, when that hurricane just absolutely decides it's going to hit the U.S., no matter how hard we wish it wouldn't, we feel a certain level of stress and a certain amount of double guessing ourselves. Because we all know that these storms do not go exactly where we predict them 5 days out. And did we release our alerts too soon and people got tired of hearing them and they ignored them? Or did we not release them soon enough and people didn't get the message? No matter how many times we say this is not like a previous storm you've encountered, we have a certain group of the population that just says, I don't care, I survived the last one, I'll survive this one. So, there's always going to be a certain amount of stress associated with the work that we do. And there's going to be a certain amount of, did I really do everything I could at the right time? The question is, how does it affect us? At what point in time does that become just normal? Yeah, maybe I should have done something a little different, to, hey, I can't sleep at night because I'm so guilt-ridden that I'm starting to take drugs or alcohol. So I hope that answers your question. Again, it was kind of one of those, it's kind of on a perspective or a continuum, because I think we all have it to a certain extent, but I wouldn't sit there and say that we all have survivor guilt, as it were.
Great, thank you. And I just want to extend a big thank you to both of you, Jim and Scott, for these wonderful presentations today. Appreciate your time and your expertise that you've shared with us and our agency. I want to wrap this up just with one final question that's really more geared towards Larry and myself with regard to what our next steps are in the Weather Service. The question is, what are the next steps for us as a group/agency, and what can those of us who identify with many of the points you brought up do now? So, to answer a couple of those items, so the points for us going forward as an agency is, first, we're starting out by socializing what critical incident stress is. We know that we have it in our agency. We know, because of the types of incidents and weather events that we deal with, that a lot of our folks throughout our agency must have some points of critical incident stress because of their familiarity with these types of events. So socializing the idea of what critical incident stress is and what some of the signs are that you yourself or a coworker might be going through critical incident stress is the first phase. So things like this webinar here today, recording it, encouraging others within your office to watch it would be a great start. I know in the fire program, we've started doing kind of a critical incident stress type scenario in both our virtual and our in-person trainings for the past several years now, and we're going to continue to do that. We're also going to continue to build resource, kind of a toolbox, if you will, for critical incident stress through the Fire Weather program and interface with other programs as well as we do that. I know the National Weather Service Training Center is looking at putting together some weather service oriented kind of critical incident stress training for us. And once again, resources that are available there. So we're definitely moving more into this arena as an agency. We're aware that this is an issue for us that we have not addressed historically, and we are doing what we can to take advantage of folks like Scott and Jim who have the training and the expertise and learn from them and try to build in-house some of those resources that are geared specifically to what weather service employees might go through. Larry, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, the all great points, Robin, and one of the reasons that we went down this road is looking at what the fire agencies were doing, and a lot of the, and I wouldn't say a lot, but there have been IMETs that have been out on incidents where fatalities have occurred, and while the fire agencies resources were available to us, it became evident that we were in a little bit of a unique situation in that the folks in the fire agencies may go home to folks that they didn't work the incident with, but they probably are going home to people that work fire so that they could have that peer interaction and somebody would understand what they've gone through and being able to talk to them, where we didn't really see that so much on the IMET side, where the IMET would go home and who do they talk to when they come home if they want to talk? So, you know, how does that person unload, or how does that person debrief themselves or you know, get some closure when the folks around them really maybe can't relate to the experience they had? So we were trying to bring that that experience more with the CISM training. I think the important thing to realize though too is that the Weather Service is now going into decision support, and the interesting thing about that is that you're, as an organization now, with the decision support and the deployment ready folks, you're going to get closer to the action, and it's interesting when you're sitting behind a desk and you issue a watch or a warning, and something bad happens. You know, we've all been there where, you know, you issue a winter storm warning, yet somebody, you know, slides off the road and gets killed, and you feel bad, but you're a little bit disconnected from it because you're not right there. But with like an incident that happens on a wildland fire, you watch these firefighters come back into camp who've lost their friend, and it just brings it home in a way that you just don't see it that often at a forecast office. And I think the folks in decision support are probably going to see this more and more too, because you know, it's the incident responders, you know, they're all friends, and you know, you're going to see reactions that you don't normally see in a forecast office. So I think it's really important to have these things in place, so that we ensure that you know, that our folks can deal with it, and that we don't get burnt out, or that we you know, take good care of our folks, so that we can take good care of you know, the public. Okay. Is anybody still there?
We are. I was just
Okay.
waiting for you to close it out, Larry, because that was our last
okay.
question. So thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Again, big thanks to Mr. Scott Russell and Mr. James Whittington for joining us today. Much appreciated, and they gave their contact information, so definitely feel free to get hold of them if you have specific questions about them. Thank you. And the next Fire on the Fives, the 5th of November is a Sunday. Maybe we'll shoot for the 6th of November. To be determined on what the subject matter will be, but we will get word out on that, and we'll plan on having another Fire on the Fives on November 6th. So with that, thank you very much for joining, and we wish you all a very good day.
Hey, Larry.